So I think I'm going to start introducing our first speaker now. And that is Sean Hanretta, Associate Professor of History, whose research focuses on the intellectual, cultural, and religious history of modern West Africa. In addition to a number of academic journal articles, he is the author of Islam and Social Change in French West Africa, History of an Emancipatory Community. Sean, take it away.
Thanks, Robin. And it should be clear from that what I'm talking about today is something I have absolutely no expertise in whatsoever. So set your expectations appropriately low. What I want to talk about is the Force Publique in the Belgian colony of the Congo. And the Force Publique is somewhat well-known, somewhat infamous, but I do want to highlight what I think are a few structural properties of how the Force Publique was organized and operated that I think might be useful for comparative purposes. So just a bit of quick background. What's now the Democratic Republic of the Congo was until from the 1880s until 1908, kind of famously the private holding of King Leopold II of Belgium, and then from 1908 until 1960, a colony of the Belgian state itself. And the Force Publique was the name that was given to kind of the unified security forces for the colonial territory. Now, the Belgian Congo was administered in a slightly complicated way. Big chunks of the territory were handed over to concessionary companies that effectively had their own private security forces. So I'm mostly going to be talking about the areas that were actually under the control of the colonial administration. And I'm happy to talk about the other areas in Q&A if you want. Now, when the colony was set up, the name for the security forces, the Force Publique, was chosen very intentionally, in that it was intended to echo a set of political theories that had developed in French and Belgian constitutional law coming out of the 18th century. People like Tessy and Sarah and Scott and others are definitely much more well qualified to talk about this than I am. But the idea of the Force Publique was that it was intended to be a security force that was quite literally the manifestation of the public will. And it was based on a set of principles of division, a division between external forces, external security, and internal security forces, basically the distinction between an army and a policing force. And it was intended to be internally self-regulating, basically highly professionalized, but under civilian control at the top. So civilians were not supposed to have direct interference in issues of training or promotion or specific operations, but were intended to direct the uses of the force. So it was based on all of these ideas of distinctions between ways that the public will could be manifested. Now, obviously in a colonial situation, none of these things actually obtained, right? A colony is both kind of in some ways the opposite of a nation state. There's no public will being manifested. And it's the opposite of a liberal state in which you have a kind of coherent civilian authority that is responsible in some ways, right, to the population of the state. But when Leopold's administration chose the name Force Publique to describe the Congolese security forces, they weren't doing so purely to kind of mislead. They were very much intending to project the idea of this as a kind of normal state that was inheriting the kind of constitutional authorities and the constitutional structures that had come out of essentially the French Revolution. But in practice, the distinctions that were supposed to operate within a Force Publique were never in existence within the Congo. So first of all, the idea that there should be a distinction between an external security force and an internal security force, between an army and a policing force, was never maintained. Basically, the colonial administration imagined itself as sort of perpetually at war with an internal enemy, the indigenous population, that could rise up in rebellion at any moment. So the Force Publique was essentially an occupying military force and a policing force at the same time. And in fact, it was conceptually impossible to even kind of maintain a distinction between these. So this quote comes from sort of late in the period, but I think it encapsulates this ethos very clearly, right? Nothing resembles a peaceful citizen more than a temporarily inactive rioter waiting for the right moment to rise. And so the kind of fusion between policing a public and suppressing uprisings was conceptually collapsed within the functioning of the Force Publique. It was also the case that the Force Publique was never able to maintain its own internal professional organization. the control over the Force Publique was put directly under the hands of local civilian authorities, local representatives of the colonial administration, who then could effectively use these soldiers as their own kind of personal private armies, their own personal security details. And this meant that any kind of systematic training, systematic enforcement of discipline within the ranks of the Force Publique was impossible. And so in keeping with the kind of collapsing of external and internal activities and security detail and political projects, the Force Publique was often used for things having nothing to do with security, but rather for tax collection, for construction work, and even sometimes being used as kind of the domestic servants of individual colonial officials, very much a kind of private labor force. In terms of the labor that made up the Force Publique, for the most part, people were recruited rather than being volunteers. And the pressure to recruit soldiers into the Force Publique was placed on individual chiefs, local indigenous political authorities. And they had then a fairly strong incentive to recruit basically some of the most marginal members of their own communities into the force. So it was often the case that people who were criminals locally, people who were held as slaves, and often the very young and the very elderly. Up until 1920, a majority of the members of the Force Publique were between the ages of 12 and 16, along with very, very elderly people who, were frail and not really able to carry out most of those duties. It was a very undesirable activity to take part in, basically until the Great Depression. And so desertion rates were very high. As a result of that, the procedure was always to train and then post members of the Force Publique far from their home territories as a way of minimizing the odds of desertion. The idea, right, is if they're farther from home, they're not able to desert. And also to mix together people from various different ethnic backgrounds. Because one of the things that was a constant concern for the state was that people who came from the same location could organize together and lead a mutiny within the Force Publique. And so the idea was that by bringing together people who had no kind of inherent shared interests, you would minimize the opportunity of the Force Publique sort of going rogue. Now, during the Depression, there were fewer options for labor activities for people, so you did see more volunteers joining the Force Publique in the 1930s, and that sort of altered those patterns a little bit. But for the most part, this basic structure persists through the 20th century up until 1960. Now, at the moment of decolonization then, the Force Publique and the structure that it had at this point lent itself very easily to being co-opted by local political forces in the civil wars that broke out immediately after the war, right? You essentially had a group of soldiers that were not under the control of a centralized military force, but rather of local political officials. They were themselves kind of accustomed to being used as the private armies of these sort of local elites. And so a series of secession movements and internal breakout in 1960, right after independence from Belgium, see sort of local officials using the Force Publique as their own private security forces and as their own private armies. And this persists really up through the independence period with the kind of atomized structure of the Force Publique and this kind of blending of political and security roles, giving itself very easily over to the kind of warlordism that obtains throughout much of the period of the post-colonial period in the Congo. This remains an issue within the Democratic Republic of the Congo until today. There have been a whole series of reforms of policing that have been tried to put in place, starting in the 1990s. But for the most part, the kind of fundamental contradictions within the idea of the Force Publique, the sort of fusion of military and policing roles, the subordination to civilian authorities at a kind of very, very local level, have persisted. And so what essentially has happened is that members of the Force Publique have been kind of co-opted, or members of the policing forces have been kind of co-opted into what are effectively crime families, right? Mafia organizations in which local populations are extorted sort of in collaboration with local political officials. So this kind of fundamental structure of the Force Publique, going back to its founding, has these consequences that echo through the right up until the present.
Thank you, Sean. Wow. Our next speaker is Lina Britto, who's Associate Professor of History and an expert on modern Latin American and Caribbean history, with a particular focus on that region's relationship to the US as structured by the drug trade and the war on drugs. Her book, Marijuana Boom, The Rise and Fall of Colombia's First Drug Paradise, has just appeared this year with University of California Press. Lina.
Thank you, Robin. So I'm just gonna do the same warning that Sean did. This is obviously not my thing. I mean, I studied the war on drugs and I'm gonna mention it, but up here I'm using kind of like the work of many people, not just historians, which I'm actually at the end of my slideshow. I'm gonna show you some of those books that I'm using as reference. Hopefully those of you who wanna learn more can go there and check them out. So I'm gonna share my PowerPoint here. Robin, let me know if I'm sharing the full screen view, right? Not the presenter's view. Perfect. Okay, so we all know like all these images from all this year. This one is from Kenosha, Wisconsin, but we were all kind of like, you know, very paying attention to the way in which the federal government was deploying the military forces in these law enforcement activities in different parts of the country. So obviously for somebody like me who is Latin American and a Latin Americanist, you know, these images were kind of like extremely familiar. And I'm not even talking about the past, I'm talking about Latin America's present. This picture here, which is very similar to the one that I just showed from Kenosha, Wisconsin, is from Santiago, Chile, October 2019. So kind of like the history of Latin America can be viewed and has been told many times through the lenses of protest, collective action, rebellions and reforms and cycles, events of revolution and counter-revolution. So this last cycle that began in September, October 2019 is kind of like not a new thing in Latin America. And here in this map, we have kind of like the layout of those protests that took place between September and October 2019, which is kind of like the very last cycle of these historical cycles of protests, rebellions, uprisings, reforms, even revolutions and counter-revolutions. Some newspapers and some public intellectuals were even talking a Latin American spring, some of them in question marks because it was still kind of like an open question. So you can see just right there, Honduras, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Buenos Aires, some of the countries where have like a massive street protest, many of them that ended up in violence. And the reasons were many, from economic inequality to political corruption to various specific aspects. But one thing that it was common to all of them, oh, another one here, another map, which is a collection of data from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project that began collecting information in February 2019. And this is kind of like the map that they produced a year later in February this year, where you can see kind of like the different protests and the different reasons for the protest depending on the color of the map, right? Like riots, violence against civilians, protests, explosions, etc. And you can see kind of like how they are concentrated on the isthmus, on all the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast, and like the areas where there are no much protests is because it's basically the Amazonian region. in the center of South America that is shared by Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, and Bolivia, and then the Patagonia. So basically everywhere else, there was political violence and protest. Just to give you some numbers from like this data project website, the countries with the highest numbers of demonstrations, Mexico first, then Brazil, then Venezuela, then Chile, and then Argentina. So let me move the chat here. So we see that in all these countries, and the reasons behind the protests were very different, but one thing that was common to all of them is that all these protests were met with tremendous violence and repression, what we call in Latin America, Mano Dura, kind of like iron fist or firm hand. I think iron fist is the best translation. So here you have examples of countries that are being governed by right-wing parties or coalitions: Chile, Brazil, Colombia, Honduras. But we see Mano Dura as well in countries that are being governed by left-wing parties or coalitions. Here are some examples: Venezuela, Nicaragua, Ecuador, and Bolivia. And why we see kind of like there's no really a change in the ideology behind the party or the coalition in government. Why Mano Dura is still kind of like the way to address this street protest and discontent. And Alejandro Velasco, a historian who has done a lot of work on modern Venezuela, he said something that I found very interesting about Venezuela, but I think it can apply to the rest of the continent. And that is that there is a long-standing belief actually among the population that only the real way to address crime or any kind of social discontent or social street public manifestation is through Mano Dura, iron fist. And the kind of like gold standard of that iron fist is the military or some form of militarized law enforcement. So this militarized law enforcement has been expanding for the last 2 or 3 decades in Latin America, from Central to South America, regardless of what is the ideology of the party or coalition in government. And that's why all these demonstrations have been confronted with extreme force. And even, for example, in the case of Chile, which is under a right-wing party, the president, Sebastián Piñera, declared war on people protesting last year. That was before, you know, the protesters succeeded in calling for a plebiscite and winning the vote in that plebiscite to replace the constitution that was written during the dictatorship for a new one. And that's where we are right now. But before all that happened, Piñera declared war on these protesters. So the only thing that really de-escalated this situation, this vicious cycle, was COVID. And here we have a map of kind of like how Latin America became the epicenter of the pandemic in August this year, when we reached 200,000 deaths by mid-August, and you see just right there. So that was kind of like the only thing that de-escalated this massive social protest in Latin America. This militarized law enforcement didn't really work, and many political scientists, who are the ones that are doing most of this research, have agreed on this aspect. They disagree on many things, but one thing that they agree on is that wherever militarized law enforcement intervene, what happened is that the violence escalates, not de-escalates. So COVID was the only thing that de-escalated the whole dynamic, and that's kind of like where we are right now, although we see outbursts of protest and social mobilization again in different countries, but for like brief periods of time. But let's go back to like this law enforcement and the effects of militarized law enforcement. So it's the gold standard in Latin America and is applied by all the governments in the region. But Brazil is the one that has been most lethal. And even before this last cycle of protests that started in 2019. In 2018, according to Human Rights Watch, Brazil police killed 6,220 people. Only in Rio de Janeiro alone, they killed 1,444 people. And you have the statistics just right there showing kind of like that, of those ups and downs and that increase. Human Rights Watch said that military-style security operations that leave a trail of death in poor neighborhoods do not enhance public security. On the contrary, these killings make communities fear the police and much less likely to collaborate with the police in the fight against crime. So everybody's kind of like trying to understand how can we explain this vicious cycle where, you know, like the people who are not directly affected by police brutality, but that perceive urban crime or criminality as a major threat asks for law enforcement. And the governments, whether they're right-wing or left-wing governments, respond with Mano Dura. And then that Mano Dura produces more human rights violations, more terror and more brutality that legitimizes even more that government and democracy in general. So how are we explaining kind of like how this vicious cycle happened? And that's when history is very useful, right? Continuing with Brazil, with the example of Brazil. Brazil was the very first country in Latin America that experienced a military coup during the Cold War and kind of like inaugurated that cycle of dictatorships in South America in 1964. So we had the contrast between 64 and now where the militarized law enforcement participated actively in the repression necessary to consolidate the dictatorship. Inaugurating, you know, kind of like this wave of military governments in Latin America. Here you see a map like where these countries in red were the ones ruled under a military dictatorship for most of the Cold War period. And then we have the case of Chile as well, right? In 1973, probably the case that has been most studied and kind of like most popular among like, you know, mainstream culture. You can see also the contrast between now and then. So what the people who have studied this militarized policing have said is that on the one hand, it's a legacy of these military dictatorships. When all these forces got trained in repression, not just in the countryside and for national security purposes, but in the cities, in urban spaces for supposedly public safety purposes. And since then, it has become kind of like the gold standard, the way to do it. So kind of like the legacy of the Cold War is one of the reasons why it explains why militarized policing or Mano Dura became the gold standard, the way to do this, regardless of the ideology of the government in place. And what we see also is that part of this has everything to do with the relationships with the United States, because many of those militarized law enforcement got trained in the School of the Americas here in the United States. And this is a cartoon produced last year in El Salvador to talk about the legacies of those death squads trained in the School of the Americas. And now the MS-13 is the name of the gang, the main Mara Salvatrucha gang that control the criminality in El Salvador. So, but that's one part of the explanation. The other part of the explanation, and with this I will conclude, is that it's not just the legacies of dictatorship and civil war during the Cold War. It's also a feature of democracy. And in this picture, we have the transition to democracy in Chile between General Augusto Pinochet and President Patricio Aylwin in 1990. And what this new scholarship is saying is that in order to really understand these legacies of the Cold War, we really need to look at democracy itself, because many times these authoritarian militarized law enforcement practices are the product of ordinary democratic politics, meaning citizens' claims and demands for protection that politicians assess according to the electoral incentives and respond to it with iron fist. So it's not just the legacies of the Cold War, it's also the shape of the democracy in Latin America and the limits of that democracy, what had produced that. And with this last example, I conclude the war on drugs has been, during the post-war period, like the perfect justification and conduit for that militarization of law enforcement. And we have the examples of Mexico and Colombia as the main epicenters of the drug economy, as producers and source countries. But in other countries that works as transit for these illegal commodities, such as Honduras or Brazil, we also see the same kind of dialogue between the military and the police force, and how the police that is devoted, or supposed to be devoted to public safety, has appropriated all these mechanisms and technologies and know-hows and discourses of militarization to do their work. And that the only thing that does that is to contribute to an escalation of the violence, where obviously unarmed citizens end up being the victims of this whole thing. And just a very quick reference to all the works that are out there about these topics that I used for this, and that you guys can consult, and they're very interesting work by like the very nice colleagues, historians, anthropologists, political scientists, etc. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Lina, really. And I'm going to introduce now our final speaker, Peter Carroll, also Associate Professor of History and a specialist on modern China. His interests range over China's urban history, popular material culture, gender and sexuality, and nationalism. His book, Between Heaven and Modernity, Reconstructing Suzhou, 1895 to 1937, was co-winner of the Urban History Association's Best Book Award in the non-North American category. Peter.
Okay, thanks very much, Robin. So what I'd like to discuss with you today is a particularly ugly incident, which is part of a much larger series of kind of historical transformations. I'll be talking about the 7/21, or that is the July 21st, 2019 Yuen Long incident. Here we have an image from it in which more than 100, perhaps hundreds, of white t-shirted thugs, for the most part, armed with iron bars, sticks, and other weapons, attacked people in a train station in Yuen Long, which is an area, a village in the New Territories near China, within the Hong Kong Special Administrative District. Here we have a different depiction of it, as it was understood rather quickly in the public mind, with the armed thugs, again, leaving mayhem, being compared to the police. And indeed, there is a strong suspicion, indeed quite much a likelihood, that this attack in the Yuen Long train station was actually coordinated between the triads, that is the local Hong Kong, mafia, and the police. And so this is a key inflection point, for thinking about the ongoing struggle, in Hong Kong, really, involving large swathes of Hong Kong civil society, the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government, the Hong Kong police, as well as the mainland Chinese, that is People's Republic of China, authorities, including the National People's Congress in Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party, and national leaders. It is also part of a marked decline in public esteem in Hong Kong for the police, which itself is rather significant. The Hong Kong police, going back to really the 1980s, has been seen as perhaps one of the best in Asia, often understood as Asia's finest. Those of you who are Americanists, your ears are tingling, because yes, that is an appropriation of New York's finest, right? A slogan that goes back to the 1870s. To the present, in which the police in Hong Kong are largely discredited by much of the population. Recent public opinion polls show that 50% of the population has zero trust in the police, and over 70% do not trust it. So I'd like to just show a little bit of a video. This is from a New York Times report, which won them a prestigious reporting prize, about the events of the 21st of July.
It was a shocking turn of events after weeks of protests in Hong Kong. A group of men in white shirts attacked demonstrators heading home after an anti-government march. Protesters said that officers ignored their repeated calls for help. Under public pressure, the police defended their actions and acknowledged small gaps in their response.
There may be some room for improvement in the deployments.
But their conduct left many wondering why they didn't do more.
Okay, so I'd like to just look a bit in depth at what we've come to know as the truth and really the scope, of this particular series of attacks, actually, which occurred, over the course of this one evening. The violence actually begins around 10 o'clock when at least 3 individuals, including this man, we see his wounds, Mr. Suo, was a chef who was walking home returning from work, was attacked by, as he said, more than 100, again, white t-shirt wearing thugs in this particular, area of Yuen Long. Okay, and I'll just keep talking. Okay, we don't need to hear this. This is a video, of the attack. What has come to light, actually, is that large groups of men in white were converging on this area beginning around, 8:30 p.m. And strikingly in the minds of many, whereas many people on the street, seeing these large groups of men walking about aimlessly, assumed that they were likely connected with triads, again, local mafia. No police were in the area or were paying attention. There were, following the attacks on individuals like Mr. Suo, 2 rather shocking attacks, in the train station, in which, again, mobs of hundreds of men in white t-shirts enter, taunt people, largely because they said that these people were returning from a protest in Hong Kong Island, part of the ongoing 2019 to 20 protests, which I'll talk about in just a second, as well as just random people who were caught, in the mayhem. Calls to the police were made, but the police do not come for some 40 minutes. When they do show, the attackers have all left. And the people there actually blame the police, for some 20 minutes, protesting, why did you not come when we called you? The police leave, and then actually at 12:26 a.m., there is yet another attack. It's what we saw when we saw the thugs lifting the gate, in the subway station. They again attack people, and some 45 people receive, treatment from the hospital in the end, due to these attacks. Now, this attack and the response to it really should be, seen, in light of 2 significant periods of protest, in Hong Kong, in recent years. The first is the 2014 umbrella movement, a movement which, as some of you might know, was protests that were launched when democratic hopes for Hong Kong were denied, when China made it clear that there would not be full universal suffrage in Hong Kong, as people were expecting. People took to the streets in great numbers. This became known as the Hong Kong uprising. The umbrella uprising, in Hong Kong, in part because people used umbrellas as passive means of protecting themselves against pepper spray. So this is the first moment of democratic, protest, in Hong Kong in recent years. And this is the second, the 2019 to 2020, still ongoing, perhaps, or not, it's hard to say, protests, which began when an anti-extradition law amendment bill was considered. We can talk about this maybe in Q&A, but this was the result of actually a murder that had occurred in Taiwan involving 2 individuals from Hong Kong. The murderer could not be extradited to Hong Kong because as part of China, the Hong Kong government, of course, does not recognize the sovereignty of Taiwan. And so this bill was a means of getting around that, of allowing a case-by-case consideration of calls for extradition. This brought on enormous protests, as you can see, in part because the bill included mainland China, and people were afraid, with good reason, that perhaps this would be a means for the government to settle political scores, or perhaps also concerns with those who are criticizing the government, such as academics, and to send them to China for adjudication under Chinese jurisdiction. This very quickly became, and still remains, although muted at the present, an enormous event. As you can see here, this is the 9th of June, over 1 million people taking to the streets, again, against extradition, and it grew only from there. The 12th of June is another important turning point, in part because the protests, which were near the government headquarters, where protesters were meeting in order to try and stop a consideration, a reading of this bill, turned violent. The police used actually some 150 rounds of tear gas. This is rather unprecedented, for Hong Kong. And public outrage was such at this turn of events that on the 17th of June, 2 million people, that's almost 30% of the population of the Hong Kong region, took to the street. The police themselves, very much become, the focus of much, popular, outrage, as we can, see here. And again, this is an enormous shift in public consideration of the police in Hong Kong. From there on, this movement does become, far more radical. There are a couple cases of suicide. Here we have a poster which is memorializing a man who committed suicide as part of the protest. We also have the Legislative Council, which was occupied, rather briefly. And this is showing actually earlier in the day. First, again, Hong Kong, which is where, according to many, people were returning in general. As we can see here. So this is the immediate context, for the events of the 21st. This is the immediate response on the part of much of civil society, that this was, recognized as a shift on the part of the police in its relations with the people of the territory. And immediately, again, there were also allegations of collusion between the police and the thugs, that perhaps this was, an attack, effectively, of the police using the triads in order to demonstrate their displeasure with the populace of Hong Kong for the criticism which they were receiving. Now, since then, the 2019-20 protests have perhaps become, even more dire. In the fall of 2019, they take a very extreme and dark turn when universities become the site of protests, and actually of, not just confrontation, but really almost pitched battles. Non-fatal battles, but battles really between protesters, and the police. There are also ongoing concerns, or have been ongoing concerns, about violence of so-called non-lethal weapons, which has blinded several people, including at least one photographer. And the National Security Bill, which, as some of you may know, was passed by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress on the 30th of June of this year, in part because the Hong Kong government had been unable to pass such a bill. Therefore, the government in Beijing did it for the people of Hong Kong, instead. So I'd like to just show that this has been an event which has ongoing resonance.
聽日就係21號啦，咁我相信大家作為元朗人咧係唔會唔記得嘅，唔好唔記得曾經喺上面發生過咩事啦。
Over the past year, on the evening of the 20th each month, people come to Yuen Long Station on the West Rail line to put up posters about the 721 incident. But in the past 6 months, none of these posters lasted more than a night.
點解你要噴嗰啲嘢嘅？可唔可以講兩句啊？你哋可以叫我都可以噴。你哋係咪有另外？Okay,
and just quickly, again, this is an event which resonates up to actually this morning. A week ago, this woman here, who is a film producer, who had actually produced 2 very hard-hitting and wonderful reports. And my next and final slide, actually, I'll list some resources, as Lina did, that you might want to consult if you're interested in this, including the 2 pieces that she produced for, Hong Kong's 60 Minutes, effectively, which were looking at, this particular incident. On the 3rd of November, she was arrested because of what are, frankly, highly dubious, ridiculous claims of her illegal use of motor vehicle data in the course of her investigative report. As people have pointed out, many news agencies in Hong Kong use these things and are not subject to arrest. Why was she arrested? Well, again, her second report had just been shown on public TV. And actually just this morning, so the 10th of November in Hong Kong, we are 14 hours behind them. She was actually arraigned, on these charges. So again, this is a particular incident whose resonance, really goes up to the present. So again, here are some really wonderful video reports on this. And let me just mention particular Northwestern connection, 2 amazing documentaries by the filmmaker Evans Chan, who is from Hong Kong, lives in New York, but is actually a Northwestern PhD in film. I was, on his dissertation committee, and have worked with him. He's made 2 wonderful films about the umbrella movement and about the ongoing 2019-20 protests. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for the 3rd of 3 really wonderful presentations we've had today. We now have some time for the speakers to take questions. And so if you'd like to ask a question, just put your name in the chat to get on the queue, or just put the text there directly and I'll read it for you. We do have some questions already. And the first one is from Helen Tilley with 2 questions for Sean. And the first is, the anti-SARS movement in Nigeria also points to colonial origins of policing problems and the police crime corruption nexus. Are there any post-colonial ruptures that also matter for DRC, Nigeria, or elsewhere? And her second question, thinking about Nancy Hunt's work on a nervous state and therapeutic insurgencies in the Democratic Republic of Congo from the 1910s to the 1940s, do you happen to know if or how insurgents encountered the Force Publique? So those 2 questions for Sean.
Great. Thanks so much, Helen, for those. Quickly, yeah, I think that these colonial continuities really do matter a lot. And so actually a comparison between Nigeria and the Congo is useful in that sense that the British do a kind of better job of distinguishing between military and policing roles. And this really has the consequence, I think, for the Nigerian military's ability to kind of imagine itself actually as a manifestation of the public will, for better or for worse, right? And also a much higher degree of centralization in its organization. But there's no question that there are some really important post-colonial ruptures. And I think for the Congo, the place to start with that is to go back to what I was saying about the existence of these concessionary companies that have their own basic kind of private security forces. And those were often much more highly centralized. So for example, the UMHK mining corporation that occupied and basically ran Katanga/Shaba province in the south had its own separate policing force that was much more professionalized, much more hierarchical, much more centralized. And so at independence, Mobutu, who of course had been a non-commissioned officer in the Force Publique before independence, and then uses his position as the head of the Force Publique as his kind of springboard to power, recognizes all of these problems. And so he specifically grabs onto the Katanga, the UMHK's private security forces as a model for trying to reorganize the Zairean, become the Zairean armed forces. But the problem is that, even throughout the Mobutu period, the ability of the state to really maintain kind of coherent centralized control over security forces, whether military or policing, throughout the entire territory is incredibly minimal. I mean, Katie Monroe can speak to this much better than I can, I'm sure. So that even if on paper, right, there's this higher degree of centralization and coordination within the forces after independence, it doesn't always take, right? And even administratively, sort of they're moved in and out of, the police are sort of moved into the armed forces, out of the armed forces, into the armed forces, back and forth. And so that distinction really doesn't ever kind of crystallize. As for sort of therapeutic insurgencies, absolutely. So another kind of, strange aspect of Belgian colonial rule in the Congo is that the Catholic Church was brought in as a kind of formal element of the administrative apparatus of the state. And Catholic missionaries in particular tended to be responsible for providing medical care, education, a lot of social services, and resistance to the kind of medical care that the Catholic missionary organizations were providing was interpreted as basically, again, it's this sort of inability to make distinctions, right? A kind of fundamental conceptual blurring of insubmission, resistance, criminality, so that even sort of fleeing from approaching colonial authorities or missionaries could be interpreted as criminal behavior, right? And so any kind of refusal to engage with those kinds of official medical and sort of more broadly therapeutic entities definitely brought people into confrontations with Force Publique, and Force Publique was often used to suppress those kinds of movements. They're often associated with sort of Protestant missionaries because Protestant missionaries are not affiliated with the colonial state. And so you even have kind of direct confrontations between the Force Publique and Protestant missions. So absolutely, there was an important part of that story too.
Our next questioner will be Charlotte Rosen. So I'd invite Charlotte to please unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah, hi. Thanks so much, everyone, for these great presentations. I'm going to briefly do something that I'm sure is really insufferable, which is to talk about the US, but I promise I'm going to link it back to a question about global policing. But so something that is really, I would say there's like two sort of prominent strains in the historiography of US policing. One is kind of to Lina's point to talk about how, the roots of sort of like racialized coercion and state violence is very much a bipartisan project, right? Like kind of against this narrative that like, oh, it's just like Reagan and Nixon being the forces behind this, but in fact, like liberals were very much participatory and continue to be invested in a police state. But then also kind of as part of that, there's also a kind of sub-narrative that comes out of examining liberal law and order, which is that efforts to reform police are repeated failures, but continue to be taken up, especially by liberal reformers. So things like, hiring more diverse police officers, holding implicit bias trainings, community policing, and things like that. And so I think one thing that U.S. historians are trying to show in their work is sort of like how reforming police has historically failed, and like to question why it continues to be brought up and invested in by policymakers, and to really interrogate the reasoning and the sort of I guess like material outcomes of investing in reform. And so I guess what I'm wondering is like if are similar narratives around police reform on the global sphere, and it's either its failures or maybe even its successes, I'm not sure. But I would be curious to hear like how that comes up, and also tying that then to sort of abolitionist movements in the US, like movements that are calling for the abolition of police in prisons come from this reality, right, that reform doesn't work. And so I'm wondering if you're seeing similar things on the global scale around, saying like, this is just like, this whole system is like morally corrupt and racist and can't be reformed at all. And so we should really just abolish it and start over. So yeah, that's my question. And to any of the panelists, I guess, anyone who wants to pick up that.
I think I want to say something just because the way in which you present this like resonates very much with one of the works that I was actually citing. It's by political scientist Yanilda Gonzalez, and the title of the book is Authoritarian Police in Democracy. And she's part of that new scholarship that is kind of like pushing the debate out of, Cold War legacies to understand what democracy itself has done for this. And her argument is basically that when on the forces that are asking for a police reform, whether that is defunding the police or like a reform, make it more accountable, whatever, are very fragmented, then politicians don't have any incentive to really, because there are no gains there for them to kind of like be consequent and bring this about, right? But when those requests or protests are not paid by fragmentation, but there's a cohesive or a social movement like coming together and consolidating, then the reforms really go through. And she studied like 3 specific cases, one in Brazil, one in Colombia, and one in Argentina in the last 10, 15, well, no, actually since the late 1990s. And that's what she found, like across national borders and in different cases, basically that's how it works. So it really has everything to do with kind of like the electoral process and what are the electoral gains for politicians, basically kind of like a balance between like the power of the people on the streets and the social movements coming together or not, because if it's fragmentation, there's no police reform happening, and the power of the police and the status quo. So kind of like a balance between the two, and only a robust social movement has proven to be kind of like the incentive of the trigger for these liberal reforms like actually happening. And it's usually kind of like liberal and progressive governments, the one that are like there to kind of like push through when the social protest and the social movements is strong enough to kind of like justify this kind of political investment.
Sean,
okay, well, yeah, sure. I mean, I'll just say that I think the context in Hong Kong and certainly China is sufficiently different that much of this really does not resonate, you know, in part because, of course, you know, we're talking about policing in the case of Hong Kong, you know, which grew up in a colonial situation, and one which is certainly really not democratic, you know, since 1997. But, you know, one which is becoming, well, an oligarchy, which is, you know, very much entrenched by the Basic Law, which has, you know, governed the Hong Kong Special Administrative District, and, you know, and one also in which the police are very much a tool of the state, you know, which is very much trimming civil liberties and the possibility of, you know, raising protests. That said, many people in Hong Kong certainly are very much aware of police reform and police reform movements, Black Lives Matter and other protests, you know, in the United States and elsewhere. But, you know, given the political realities in Hong Kong, I don't think these questions particularly have much purchase there.
Thank you, Peter. We have one other question from Joe Barton directed at Lina. And the question is, you draw a striking, revealing continuity between Cold War regimes and their democratic successors. How and why did militarized policing gain legitimacy in democratic regimes? A novel understanding of public order? A felt need to shore up democracy with shows of force?
That's a great question. Thank you so much, because it allows me to talk about something that I didn't even mention in my intervention, and that is how like the end of these military dictatorships or the end of these civil war conflicts, right? Because in the Southern Congo it was mostly military dictatorships. In Central America it was mostly kind of like also military governments, but in a context of civil war. So in these two cases, the democratic transitions in both cases are happening in the context of neoliberal reforms. So like the institution of these neoliberal reforms created a series of socioeconomic and political inequalities that were the perfect ground for a lot of social discontent, for the emergence of illegal economies of all kinds, not only the drug economy, that kind of like justify these calls for law enforcement and for Mano Dura, right? So it is kind of like that historical transition between, you know, the Cold War and the neoliberal reforms of the post-Cold War period, what created the conditions and the circumstances that justify a militarized law enforcement. So that's why it's important to look at both things and not just paying attention to the legacies of the Cold War, because then we will be missing kind of like half of the story, which is the socioeconomic inequalities that neoliberal reforms produce and all the illegal economies that created, or that helped to create in many ways, and therefore kind of like the urban violence that it was associated to these new illegal economies that were emerging in all these countries going through these democratic transitions. So that's kind of like the context where a militarized policing is justified and is present to the public as justification, and those who are not suffering directly the consequences of militarized policing feel entitled to ask for more, right? And to make calls for like a iron fist.
If I could, oh, yeah. Sorry.
Please, Sean, please.
I was just going to say something really quickly, kind of in response to Charlotte's point about kind of the paradoxical effects of reform, particularly the elaboration that she put into the chat. I mean, one way where you sort of do see this playing out, again, as Peter said, sort of the context here is really radically different. But through the 20th century and early 21st century, right, what reform has typically meant professionalization, right? So trying to increase training, trying to increase accountability, allow for discipline. But certainly in the last, 15, 20 years, there's been an adoption of a kind of version of community policing. It's called kind of policing à proximité, right? So close-up policing. And the paradoxical consequence of this, though, is that, right, that actually pushes then against the kind of reforms that are about centralizing and professionalizing the forces, so that what the kind of policing à proximité has actually effectively done is, by sort of further decentralizing the operations of the policing forces, it's put them more effectively under the control of these kind of local criminal organizations, right? So it's a different kind of paradoxical effect than the one that you're talking about in the context of the US, but there is this sense in which kind of the adoption of that model of reform has exacerbated some of the kind of inherent structural problems.
Are there any other questions for our presenters? We do have a minute or so left. Well, if not, we are almost at 2 o'clock, so perhaps you'll join me in thanking our presenters, Lina, Sean, and Peter, for their really wonderful presentations.